Hi, I'm Daniela Cruz, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Dallas Museum of Art, and our interviewer, Janelle Montgomery, speaks with curator Dr. Nicole Myers about the exhibition Berthe Morisot, Woman Impressionist. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, we're at the Dallas Museum of Art with Dr. Nicole Myers, Senior Curator of European Painting, to discuss the show Berthe Morisot, Woman Impressionist. Thank you so much for joining us, Nikki.
Thank you for having me.
So Morisot was a respected member of the cohort of painters we know as the Impressionists, and yet her work is very rarely studied or even exhibited even today. How did you go about choosing the works for this show and organizing them into the exhibition? And what does it tell us not only about Morisot, but also about the Impressionists?
Yeah, it's really surprising that Morisot was one of the founding members of the French Impressionist group. She was the only woman to join this rebel band of artists in 1874. And she was really well known and celebrated and praised in her time. And yet in the 20th century, her role has been diminished, sometimes eliminated in the telling of the story of French Impressionism. So the goal of our project, of course, is really to reestablish her reputation and give visitors a chance to see her work, because so many are in private collections, so there's a real challenge there, a lack of accessibility. In terms of organizing the exhibition, luckily there have been exhibitions over the years, not in the US since 1987, but more in France and in Spain and Europe, for example. So there are some great books that are out there, catalog raisonnés of her work as well. So Sylvie Patry, my co-curator on the project, and I, really started by going through the literature. But the interesting thing is, so many of the works we only know by small black and white photos. And Morisot is an artist, as you can see when you go through the exhibition, who constructs almost entirely through color and through these diaphanous layerings of glazes and translucent colors, and how she builds up her compositions. Looking at a small black and white photo of her work tells you absolutely nothing. So we started with works that met the theme of our exhibition, which is exploring Morisot's depictions of the modern figure. And from there, as we were putting together our checklist, and as I mentioned, so many are in private collections, oftentimes we were met with surprises when we would go to private collectors' homes to talk to them about the show and to see the work that we knew about, that we were interested in, and then perhaps to see other works by Morisot that we only knew, again, by not great reproductions, and were just bowled away. There were probably at least 4 paintings that we added to the checklist on the spot. Wow. Because we were so amazed by these works that just don't read at all. And I would say even in color reproduction, we say this always of artists, the importance of seeing the original, because no reproduction can ever do the original work justice. But Morisot in particular, I think, really suffers, even in color, because her paintings are activated by light and by you, the viewer, approaching and looking.
And the texture of the paint on the
texture
canvas.
And the glistening, and these are all qualities that critics of her time commented upon. And when they're photographed, they have a flatness to them and sometimes a muddiness, which is completely the opposite effect of how they appear when you stand in front of them.
So we have 4 galleries, 72 works, is that right?
It is 6 galleries.
6 galleries, okay.
72 paintings. So we kept it to paintings only, although she did do watercolor, she did do drawings, but paintings were really where she staked her claim as a modern avant-garde painter. And also where, as a woman, she was really attempting to separate herself from the amateur practice, the kinds of art practices that women of the middle class, upper middle class, were encouraged to do more as a hobby or as part of their basic education. Things like drawings and watercolors. Oil painting in the French tradition was at the top of a hierarchy, and so is the human figure.
Right.
So she started as a landscape painter and worked alongside artists like Corot. She admired Daubigny, but in about 1869 really decided to change her path and to focus on figure painting. And that really became the core of her production, the majority of her works. And again, that's why we chose that as the theme within our exhibition.
So as a bourgeois woman in this period, how was she able to kind of create a career for herself in painting?
It was not easy. I think it's a story that's not as well known today. The fact that she could not have taken the prestigious art classes at the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts, which was the top free school offered by the government, women were not admitted until 1897, 2 years after she dies at the age of 54. So like other women who were seeking professional careers, it wasn't easy. You had to be creative. First, you had to have financial means to take lessons, to have tutors, and her family was incredibly supportive actually and allowed her and her sister.
It's also a rarity.
A rarity. So you had to have money, you had to have a supportive family, which she did, and most often you also had to have a close connection with an established male artist. And in the case with Morisot, her family and the Manet family, Edouard Manet, the great realist painter, became close, and he became not her teacher by any means, but very much a mentor to her and introduced her into certain circles. And so there's a formula of how women, really until the mid-20th century, were able to, against all odds, achieve a professional career, and she had all three of those. But it's not to say that even with those three things that it's easy, and I think it's important, you know, to think about not just gender, but her social class as well, that there was a rigid world in which she lived, and as much as she chose a very unconventional lifestyle in pursuing a career, she was still very much a woman of the upper middle class and kind of still stayed socially within the boundaries of propriety. And so we see that a bit in her letters in lamenting wanting dealers, for example, in her early career to sell her paintings. And you gather from the letters that it wasn't appropriate for her as a single young woman to be selling her paintings.
Right.
You weren't supposed to engage in commerce. Your role was as, you know, a wife and as a mother. And so she relies on her mother, married established woman, to help. She relies on Manet to help connect her to important dealers like Durand Ruel. But you sense her holding herself back in a way because it, maybe for her, that really pushed the boundary too far of jumping out of the box that she was supposed to stay in.
Yeah. So for us today, it's hard to even think of this as an obstacle, but even something the Impressionists are known for, the open air painting, would have been a problem for someone in Morisot's position, yes?
It was. We have letters from her actually of being harassed by children, the spectacle of a woman painting in oil. I think that's an important distinction on a certain scale, outdoors. And so painting in the city, the urban streets of Paris, things that were made famous by colleagues like Monet and Renoir was just about impossible for her to do. And so she would try out in the countryside or sometimes, you know, at the seaside, for example, and we know that she was harassed. And for example, we have a painting in the DMA's collection of the port of Nice. So she was visiting the city of Nice, and it's not on our show because it's a pure marine, not a figure painting. And we know from her letters that she was really being hassled so much that she rented a boat to be able just to go out in the middle of the harbor to be able to paint in peace, because the idea of, again, the upper middle class woman, you know, painting.
Upper young lady, yes.
Yeah, and so we can't take that for granted. The challenges for women were quite different than that of her male cohort, and an exhibition like this really shows just how exceptional she was, you know, to pursue the career. She had this incredible talent, but to stay the path
and to succeed.
And to succeed. Yeah, it's really amazing what she was able to do, and again, I think that's a story that I find is not told nearly enough, and it's not to belabor the point, but just art is always a reflection of a person's time and place, their social class, the politics that are going around, and it also shapes how the works were received.
You mentioned that most of the works in this exhibition focus on the figure. How did Morisot's treatment of the figure differ from that of her contemporaries like Degas, like Renoir?
Yeah, what's interesting is that Morisot wasn't unique in her depiction of upper middle class life, of genre scenes, and of Parisian femininity. What sets her work apart from those of her male and her female peers is her style. And that was, again, something that was recognized by her peers and critics of the time, that her absolutely radical painting style with these almost gestural, loose brushstrokes, how she dissolves her figures into their backgrounds, was something that was really innovative and unique to her. And I think critics didn't know how to account for this boldness. I mean, she was really seen, and they described her as such, as being a leader of Impressionism, as being the most Impressionist of the group. And the other side of that coin is that I think they were so astounded that they ascribed it to her gender, that this was a feminine way of painting or a feminine vision, that it's biological how she's painting, which of course is total nonsense. But I think they didn't know how to make heads or tails of this artist who seemed to come out of nowhere with this style that was just breathtaking. And what I love about the criticism of the time is that there were critics, of course, who absolutely hated her work because it was too sketch-like, criticism that all the Impressionists got, but again, she was seen as doing this too much. But even the ones who didn't like her work, who panned it, still couldn't help but admit that the effect was amazing. And they wondered, how did she achieve this? So whether you liked it or hated it, they had to admire how unique it was.
Innovative.
Yeah.
I'm also intrigued by her finished paintings, like A Child in the Red Apron, I think, is one that's just gorgeous. But you can see she just kind of fades away from the central subject as she gets towards the edge of the canvas. Where does that idea come from? How does she start to explore that? It's very interesting.
I mean, she starts, you know, in the late 1860s and early 1870s with developing, again, this kind of loose sketch-like aesthetic that her cohort are all developing, you know, simultaneously, but in different ways. But she will take this to such an extreme. She really pushes that boundary that we don't know today. Honestly, if she considered it finished and just achieved the effect that she wanted and walked away, or unfinished, it can be really challenging to know. Of course, we have a whole section of the exhibition dedicated to that question. In some instances, when we know she exhibited the work in her lifetime, we can assume she considered it finished, but it is not at all obvious when you look at them which those works are. So for example, the great self-portrait that looks really unfinished with all that exposed area of unpainted canvas in the background. She chose that to represent herself in an exhibition of avant-garde artist self-portraits in a show where Monet and Van Gogh had self-portraits. So it really gives a sense of the fact that that became her brand and how she was known. And still, as I said, a question that we still have today.
Yeah, and in that self-portrait, you really get a tension between what portion of her identity she wants to put forward, whether it's the upper middle class woman or the painter, because both of those ideas are present and yet not present in the image.
I love that too, because here she is showing herself as an artist, and of course in the lower left-hand corner we do see the tools of her trade, but they are barely sketched in, this palette and this paintbrush. And the most commanding thing about the self-portrait is her confident gaze.
Yes.
And I mean, for me, one of the things that I love about her figure painting, and that I do think distinguishes how she treats the figure from those of her peers, is she gives her figures these incredible expressions that can often be ambiguous. It can be hard to know what the sitters might be thinking or feeling. You know, traditional images of motherhood, like her early work of The Cradle, which is a painting actually of her sister, with her sister's first child. You know, it's not your typical scene of motherhood. It's actually a traditional pose for melancholy. And there's a sense of longing and wistfulness. And actually her sister had been a professional painter as well and gave up her career, as was expected, when she married and had a child. And we know that was a difficult transition for her. So, you know, in Morisot's own self-portrait, this very self-confidence gaze actually hides the fact that in her letters and in her diary, which have been published, which we can read portions of today, she was racked with doubt. And painting was always a struggle for her, as much as it seems like when we look at the paintings, the looseness that it just flowed from the tip of her brush. It's a real contrast when you read her words with how she presents herself.
Rococo painters from the 18th century like Boucher and Fragonard influenced the Impressionists, including Morisot. What were some of the ways that the Rococo was reflected in her works? And then what are some of the ways she updates those for her own time?
What's interesting is that Morisot, one of her trademarks in the Impressionist exhibitions, is her depiction of a type called La Parisienne, or the Parisian woman, which is a really elegant, fashionable woman who's identifiable in terms of her station, her social class, through her costume and her accessories, things like fans or little lapdogs. And that type was something that was not unique or original to Morisot, and in fact was an 18th century invention. But what critics in her time started to see from about 1880 forward in her paintings was a real affinity with the spirit of Rococo painters like Fragonard and Boucher because of her depiction of elegant upper-class Parisian life. But more beyond the subject matter, they also saw it in her handling of paint. And I think if you think of Fragonard, and he does what are called these fantasy heads, which were these loosely sketched, quickly painted busts of often elegant men and women. There is an affinity there stylistically, and the sort of silvery and blonde tones that we get in a lot of the paintings, like the DMA's Winter, for example, was connected to the 18th century, and Fragonard specifically. They see it in the palette, they see it in the brushstroke, And also, I mean, you can look at this as positive and negative, and also the subject matter, which was seen as frivolous or superficial or elegant and light and charming. So when they connected her to the 18th century, in one sense, they were really establishing her in this lineage of great French tradition. But on the other hand, it was almost a backhanded compliment, because Rococo was seen as an effeminate style and something very appropriate and natural for a woman to gravitate towards. But when the same thing was lanced at, let's say, Renoir, it was a very different implication.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We want to thank Dr. Myers for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to dma.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.